to Snap Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket. I'm your host for today, Macy Helm, the Snap Ed Coordinator at the University of Nevada, Reno. On today's episode, we will provide an update from the Snap Ed Program Development Team, or PDT. If you don't know what the PDT does, I encourage you to listen to episode 1 of this podcast for details. Recently, the PDT committee met in Chicago for the annual meeting to receive updates from our federal partners and to update the strategic plan. Joining us on the show today is our guest, Dr. Andrea Morris, who leads the SNAP-Ed program at Alabama A&M and is the co-chair of the PDT Executive Committee. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We're excited to have you. And as a refresher, can you just remind us who the PDT is and the goals of the committee?
Sure. So the Land Grant University Program Development Team is a 17-person team, and they represent all extension regions and are comprised of family and consumer science program leaders, other university administrators, SNAP-Ed program coordinators, the SNAP-Ed Land Grant University System Assistant, and a federal partner from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. The overall goal of the program development team is to strengthen SNAP-Ed programming across the land grant university system. This is accomplished through the work of several committees and is supported through annual assessments that are collected from each land grant university that receives SNAP-Ed programming funds.
Wow, that's great. And it sounds like quite a diverse group within that PDT. And you mentioned that work is done through subcommittees. Can you share with the listeners a bit more about the priorities of each of those committees?
Sure. So we have 4 committees or work groups, and each has a main focus. We have legislative education, shared expertise, partnership, and then the executive committee. The focus of the Legislative Executive Work Group is to train LGU SNAP-Ed leaders and to educate internal and external stakeholders about the value that the land grant system brings to effective and impactful SNAP-Ed program delivery. The focus of the Shared Expertise Group is to share the expertise within the land grant university system to strengthen and support SNAP-Ed programming coordinators. The Partnership Work Group focuses on activities to leverage LGU capacity for collaborative action related to nutrition security. And lastly, we have the Executive Committee, who facilitates the work of the Program Development Team. So over the last year, a lot of work came out of the Program Development Team, and I'd like to share just a few. So the launch of the website for LGUs to share and access resources. I'm sure you've already shared it here previously, but I'll share it again once more. It's snaped-edresources.extension.org. We also had the annual survey of expertise. We conducted that this year with all LGUs implementing SNAP-Ed to collect general program information. Is shared with ECOP, FNS, and some other stakeholders as needed. Now, we do have plans for the 23-24 survey, and it will include some additional questions on SNAP-Ed impacts. So please, I'm asking your listeners to please be on the lookout for that. We also had the 1862 and 1890s in the land grant university system who do not currently conduct SNAP-Ed programming. We surveyed them to understand their interest in future funding, as well as barriers and any opportunities to implementation. We got the opportunity to send a representative of the program development team to the annual SNAP-Ed conference, and they were there to advocate for LGU SNAP-Ed programs. We also did a survey of LGUs on online programming. And one of our main focuses, we're very proud, this is a great communication effort that the program development team is the facilitation of those regional calls where we are able to discuss current events, opportunities, and challenges. These calls are an opportunity for the program development team to gather feedback on various initiatives and disseminate team outputs.
Wow, that's a lot of work. And it sounds like the PDT really stays busy year to year.
Yeah.
And during that annual meeting, I know that there were also discussions around how the PDT can support the entire LGU system, especially when thinking about tribal institution partners. And so what does equity within the LGU system look like? What was discussed with the PDT?
Yeah. So it's always about trying to bring the conversation or the focus back to the fact that we are a system of land grant universities. And so we have to be mindful to support all the LGUs in that programming space at the level that is necessary for each individual university.
And that support and collaboration is so important. Are there any recommendations for building those collaborations across the LGU system?
Sure. So build the relationship with the LGUs in your state, region, nationwide before any work is ever needed. So establishing those relationships before you need it, and then the collaboration can develop from that place. So start with a conversation to get to know the beautiful work that's being done and what opportunities there are to support and collaborate. During our annual meeting, we began to do just that by having a conversation with colleagues from 1994 institutions and how we, as the program development team, could foster better relationships and provide information and about nutrition education programming to the 1994 LGUs. We had a really good dialogue and have some action steps identified to stay connected and move us forward.
Those are great tips, and we look forward to having those action steps or action items shared with our listeners. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I know we also had mention of the PDT meeting with federal partners during that Chicago meeting. So wondering what were some of the takeaways and highlights from those conversations?
Yes, our federal FNS and NIFA have been consistent in staying connected to the program development team, and they did join us for our annual meeting again this year. And so they provided highlights regarding new funding and program opportunities, specifically from NIFA. We learned about the Food Waste Project, the WIC Workforce Development Initiative, a SEN for Better Health programming, and other funding opportunities. FNS share updates regarding the SNAP-Ed guidance and some other initiatives that the Nutrition Education Branch has started regarding snacks and pairs data collection. I encourage the listeners to join their regional SNAP-Ed program calls so that PDT can share those updates and opportunities.
Absolutely, and thanks for that recommendation to join those regional calls. And then I know, of course, Farm Bill is on everyone's mind. And were there any talking points shared by the Extension Committee on Organization and Policy, otherwise known as ECOP, that our listeners might be able to share with their legislators or administrators?
So the most important takeaway that we discussed during the call, during our meeting was, and this is, it doesn't depend on whether it's a farm bill or not. This is important all the time, is that we need to continue to highlight the efforts and the impacts of our programs. And we can do that through your university government relations unit. Make sure they're knowledgeable about the nutrition education programs that you have coming through the university. For the extension directors or administrators, be sure they're updated and they can lift up the programming. And with community leaders and other stakeholders, invite them to programming so that they can see true impacts of programming beyond just a flat report or infographic. There's wonderful, impactful work being done, and so we need to continue to lift up our programs.
Absolutely. Well, this has been so helpful, and you've shared so many great tips and takeaways. And so just thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to hear that update. And it sounds like the PDT really does a lot of great work to support LGU implementing agencies. And thank you all for listening. And we hope that you learned something new today. We look forward to seeing you next time on SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket. You can find the podcast episode on the E-Extension SNAP-Ed Resource Center at snap-edresources.extension.org. Thank you.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved, are not a legal or expert interpretation by, an endorsement of, and do not necessarily represent those of South Dakota State University, the South Dakota Board of Regents, E-Extension, a SNAP-Ed state agency, the Food and Nutrition Service, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or the United States Department of Agriculture and their employees and agents. The SNAP-Ed Land-Grant University Program Development Team, SCSU, and the above-named parties, employees, and agents are not responsible for and do not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening. The primary purpose of this podcast series is to educate and inform. This podcast series does not constitute professional advice or services. The developers of SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket and the above-named parties assume no liability for any activity in connection with this podcast or for use of this podcast in connection with any other website, computer, playing device, or use of any information contained in the podcast. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not copy, edit, modify, or redistribute. This podcast is intellectual property of South Dakota State University and cannot be used without permission. To inquire about permissions for using this content, reach out to LGU PDT at lgusnaped@gmail.com.